Batman Caped Crusader is a series that feels like it's been in development forever, having moved from HBO Max to Prime Video. The series is now finally out, having aired all 10 of its episodes at once, and I binged it, and gotta say, while I liked a lot of the show, I will also say it does not feel worth that long wait, and even without that wait, it didn't quite live up to the hype. This video will be my review for Season 1 of Batman Caped Crusader, and will include full spoilers for the season. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe. I tend to begin my reviews by talking about the technical aspects of the series first, so that's what I'll be doing here as well. The voice acting is mostly pretty good. The new voice actor for Batman does a pretty good job at feeling different between Bruce Wayne and Batman, and his Batman voice is pretty good, although I definitely have heard a lot of better Batman voices. The music is decent as well, although I wouldn't say anything too memorable, even in the intro, which fits the general vibe and aesthetic of the series, but is the type of intro that I feels like that in Season 2 I'll probably just skip every time. What was very disappointing about the technical aspect of the series, and was noticeable from the beginning, was that the animation was not great. Considering how long the series was in development, the animation was so disappointing. The characters tend to be very stiff and not very mobile, there's little to no action or fight scenes, and in general, the animation was extremely dull and unimpressive, which contrasts strongly with other recent animated comic book series like My Adventures with Superman, or especially X-Men 97, and I gotta say that's something that's difficult to get past. Throughout the 10 episodes, I was never once impressed by the animation, action, or visuals. The visuals never being impressive either connects to another issue, the very poor use of the setting. Batman Caped Crusader is set in the 1940s, but does absolutely nothing with that. The aesthetic is quite boring and uninspired, the way people talk feels pretty modern, and the series does not abide by the rules of the time. Firstly, the series would be set either during or right after World War II, but yet there's no mention of anything of the sort. But what's really frustrating is how little the series cares about the social norms or even the rights or defining characteristics of the time. James Gordon is somehow a black police commissioner, while Renee Montoya is an openly lesbian policewoman and even kisses Harleen Quinzel in public. This is not what the 1940s were like. Sure, this is not the real world, so it's not unfeasible for this version of the 1940s to be more progressive, but if they're going to ignore the defining traits of the time, what is exactly the point of it being a period piece? Just set it in the present day, especially since they don't do anything interesting with the aesthetic of the time. Really, the only thing that sets this apart as being in the 1940s is the very limited technology. Aside from that, it could easily just be in the present day, and in fact would just make a little bit more sense. That is easily my biggest issue with the series, but it's a big one. It's something that very much holds it back, and it's something that I can never not notice while watching the episode. The series itself is quite episodic, feeling very similar to Batman the Animated Series in that way. Episodic storytelling has never been my preferred seasonal structure, but thankfully the series does have bits of connecting tissue between episodes, especially near the end, and the season also gets better and better over time. The beginning of the season, however, is very rough. Episode 1 is titled In Treacherous Waters, and in particular was not a good start to the series. Aside from one really great Batman interrogation moment, the episode was boring and made an incredibly unusual decision in gender swapping the Penguin. But not just that, she's also a mother and has a very soft voice. Just a really weird decision that does not pay off. It makes for probably the worst adaptation of the Penguin ever, or at least one of. The series takes a lot of liberties with the villains from here, some pay off, some don't. This is probably the worst of them though. Episode 2 is titled And Be a Villain, and deals with the murder mystery surrounding the series' version of Clayface, which turned out to be maybe the one and only episode that did feel like it used the time period to its advantage, feeling like an old detective noir. The murder mystery worked as well, as first I thought it was Basil Karlo since he's Clayface, but he died, which turned everything around, leading to the reveal that he was the killer and that wasn't Karlo. Clayface's abilities were interesting in their visuals and the way they connected to the story, and also his design is really creepy. This take on Clayface is a lot more grounded and very different from the typical version, but as early as we are into the Batman's career, this definitely fits better, as it does also fit the time more. This episode starts a trend that the series follows of individual episodes putting their focus on specific characters that are not Batman. This ends up being, I think, more of a negative than a positive, as it maybe feels like Batman himself maybe didn't get enough to do, especially didn't get enough lines or maybe even enough screen time. That being said, the season did give Batman a nice arc of learning to let others in, which culminates in the end of the season, which I'll get back to. This episode's focus was on Renee Montoya, who ended up being easily the most interesting character to come out of the GCPD, even if her investigation being done by Batman would have been a a good opportunity to show off his detective skills, which were, for the most part, not too well explored this season. And honestly, her being the best character to come out of the GCPD does not mean much because, for the most part, I didn't love this version of the characters of the GCPD. Episode 3 is titled Kiss of the Catwoman and introduces Catwoman, obviously, who I'd say is just a decent portrayal of her. Decent chemistry with Batman, but nothing incredible since it wasn't shown too much. While the whole idea that she's more and more inspired by Batman is interesting, but mostly because it's just fun to watch, not because it's too compelling. Where this episode shines is in its showcase of Bruce's origin while Bruce goes to therapy. For the most part, the origin is the typical one, but the moment where Kid Bruce finally snaps and decides on his mission is a pretty powerful one, with Bruce coming off genuinely scary in front of Alfred. It's only by episode 4, titled The Night of the Hunters, where stories start to carry over from before as the GCPD go after Batman. The episode focuses heavily on the GCPD, which again, like I said, is not too interesting, since this is a very, very boring version of James Gordon with little to no personality, and also because he just doesn't fit into this world, and the corrupt cops are just cartoonishly evil, unleashing a serial arsonist just to capture Batman. Flash in particular is just straight up evil. He has no redeeming qualities, with the same also mostly going for Bullock, who is so much less interesting here than he typically is. In general, the corruption of Gotham is a very large focus of this season, but it's interesting only when it's really focused on Harvey Dent, for instance. But with Flask and Bullock, it's not exactly subtle, they're just kind of evil. Firefly, or I guess Firebug, is a fine interpretation of the character. He's insane and super creepy and has a very effective death. But I guess the fact that he can't fly, which is why his name is Firebug and not Firefly, does make him a little bit less interesting of a physical threat. I do, however, really like the whole fire escape scene because it is always awesome to see Batman be an actual superhero, not just stopping crime, but also saving lives, which also then works really well to form a sort of respect between Batman and Gordon. Episode 5 is titled The Stress of Her Regard, and Barbara Gordon is the main protagonist, who is a huge departure from the comics. She's race-bent, aged up significantly, and turned into a lawyer, so basically a completely different character who just doesn't resemble her comic counterpart at all, aside from being the daughter of James Gordon, and the season doesn't do a good enough job, in my opinion, to develop her to the point where it feels worth it. That includes this episode, which establishes a bit of a friendship between Batman and Barbara, and I'd say it mostly works. This episode also establishes a friendship between Barbara and Harleen Quinzel, as the series takes an extremely different approach to the character of Harley Quinn, completely detaching her from the Joker, even debuting before him, changing her design, changing her race, changing everything about her aside from the fact that she's a therapist and her name is Harley Quinn. In a vacuum, this does work fine. The episode does have a creepy villain with a connection to some of the main characters, but also she doesn't feel or look anything like Harley Quinn, which is true for when she's out of the costume as well, which just makes you wonder why they even called her that in the first place. It's in this episode where Harleen and Montoya go on a date, they'd even kiss in public, which just completely took me out of the world. I mean, again, this is the 1940s. Why does it feel like it's the present day in everything but technology? The actual content of the episode is interesting, but there's just so much holding it back that it ends up being just okay. Episode 6 is titled Night Ride and takes a sharp turn into the supernatural, which on one hand I do appreciate it. I like it when Batman deals with both grounded and fantastical threats. On the other hand, Gentleman Ghost being Batman's first supernatural threat is a bit of a weird decision since he's a huge jump from the villains we've seen so far. It's a sharp turn, he's very supernatural, but also he's not actually really a Batman villain. That being said, I did actually quite like Gentleman Ghost's characterization, and I really liked the way Batman investigated him and then found out a way to defeat him throughout the episode. It was some of the best detective skills shown on screen. The episode also had a really nice focus on the relationship between Batman and Alfred, whose near death brings an emotional side out of Bruce that we have not seen yet, and that's quite powerful. The episode also puts a heavy focus on Harvey Dent, one of the most important characters of the season, which, alongside his appearances prior to this, show how he's an atypical take on the character, as he's not exactly a good person prior to becoming Two-Face, which does end up making for a unique and interesting take on the Two-Face story. Speaking of non-Batman villains, episode 7 is titled Moving Target and uses Onomatopoeia, a Green Arrow villain, as an assassin attempting to kill Barbara. His design is definitely great. I mean, it's kind of just like taken exactly out of the comics. Only saying onomatopoeias is fun, and I love the moment of Batman saying pow before taking him out. Beyond that, the episode focuses heavily on the two Gordons, which is fine and all, but nothing incredible since neither are very good adaptations of the characters, and they don't really have too interesting of a dynamic either, and also then because their argument felt a bit off. Like, Barbara was being very naive, only to then just be proven wrong, which I'd say kind of just makes her look bad. She was just wrong the whole time. The twist that the assassins were after Barbara was a good and unexpected one, even if the reason for the hit was kinda dumb. Then the twist that Jim Corrigan went for the deal was even more unexpected, but also I'd say less effective and feels kind of random. For those of you who don't know, Jim Corrigan becomes the Spectre in the comics. This does not feel like someone who would go on to become the Spectre. And again, when it comes to the corruption of the cops in this season, it feels like they didn't give them enough grayness. Like, they're all just kind of evil. Jim Corrigan is just willing to murder someone out of nowhere for some money. Like, they don't have enough grayness. Harvey Dent does get that inner conflict, but the cops just don't. There are good cops and there are bad cops, and that is it. Episode 8 is titled Nocturne and is the start of a 3-episode run that is better than any episode that came prior. This episode puts a wild twist on the Robin story, including cameos of Dick, Jason, Stephanie, and Carrie, which were fun cameos, but I really hope this doesn't mean that this version of Batman will never get a Robin, because after the arc of this season of him learning to work with others, a Robin would be just what he needs. So I'm hoping that maybe one of these becomes a Robin. I wouldn't even mind if they do something different where it's somebody else, maybe Tim Drake, the only one here who didn't appear, or even Damian Wayne, but I want him to get a Robin. But what really worked here in this episode is how the episode incorporated Batman's dynamic with children, which always tugs at specific heartstrings. This comes into play through the villain Nocturne, who very much reminds me of Ace from Justice League Unlimited, in that she's a young girl cursed with powers that ruin her childhood, whose condition causes pain towards others, which prompts Batman to show his compassionate side while also cementing his no-kill rule in a very powerful moment that seems clearly inspired by that famous scene, which makes for a fantastic end to an otherwise really good story. Along the way, the episode gives focus towards Harvey Dent as well, showing his inner conflict as he finally decides to do the right thing, leading to him having acid thrown in his face. Harvey's story was effective at making him feel like a very three-dimensional and conflicted person, the exact opposite of all the cops, effectively leading to the story being the focus of the last 2 episodes. This was definitely the best episode of the season so far, and it's the one that I came out of feeling the most impressed as of now. Episode 9 is titled The Killer Inside Me and puts a bit of a twist on the Two-Face story. His design is distinct, being on the other side of his face and not having any color, just looking like a melting face. A design that definitely grew on me pretty fast, and one that definitely fits the tone of the series. Up until this point, Harvey has been torn between his good and bad sides. His scarring split that in 2. One side is now good and the other is all bad, but even with the bad, he exclusively goes after criminals. All in all, Harvey's story is a very compelling one, and a worthy portrayal of the Two-Face story, whose origin is always one of the most compelling villain origin stories, and it's done really, really well here. In addition, Bruce gets involved, which leads directly into the beginning of his rampage, an extremely unique addition to the Two-Face story with a great showcase of this version of Batman's flaws as a part of his arc throughout the season. The moment, for instance, when Batman snaps at Alfred after Alfred kind of implies that maybe Dent's downfall is his fault, is easily the best moment of voice acting of the season, and it's the moment in the season where Batman / Bruce Wayne felt the most like a real person. There's nothing absolutely breathtaking here, nothing to bring this episode to something like a 10 out of 10, but just about everything in this episode does work, making for the best episode of the series. Episode 10 is titled Savage Night, and is the finale of the season, and while it has its moments, it's not quite up there with the previous. First of all, at this point I've kind of just lost interest in a few of the characters that are given focus here, like Barbara Gordon, Jim Gordon, and maybe even Harvey Bullock. There's some of the most boring and uninteresting takes on these characters ever. Secondly, the episode feels very derivative in that, like episode 7, it's all about the supporting cast trying to escape a group of people trying to kill one of them. It's the same plot. What is better than episode 7 is that it involves Two-Face, who at this point is already reformed a bit, which leads right into a very impactful death. If nothing else, I do like how this series is not afraid to kill their villains off, like they also did with Firebug, and I've always thought that Two-Face only really works in his origin anyway, and not much beyond that, or at least it's never as compelling. This episode does have probably the best showcase of Batman in the season as well, with some good fight scenes, to looking really badass acting in the fog of the episode. The gun moment was one that had me on the edge of my seat, since the series has taken some liberties with a lot of characters, and because in his earliest appearances, the ones that did at least a little bit inspire this show, he did kill people and he did use a gun. I was scared for a second they might actually have Batman kill with a gun, and if they did, I kind of probably just would have not watched this show anymore. Thankfully, that's that's not what happened. This moment instead showcases Batman's hatred for the weapon that killed his parents, but also implies he mastered the same weapon so as to fully understand it, because he shot a few times and hit exactly where he wanted to. And that was a moment that I really liked. I also really love the moment where Batman finally called Alfred by his first name, which acted as a great culmination to his arc. And then obviously the shot of Batman in front of the lightning is just absolutely badass. This episode definitely has some of the best Batman moments of the season. Unfortunately, what does hold the episode back is the actual story being repetitive and some of the characters who are given focus just being uninteresting. Something that was clearly missing from the season was the Joker, although he got a really good tease at the end of this episode. So in the end, Batman Caped Crusader's score average is a 7.4 out of 10, which I'd round down to a 7 because I don't like having decibels in my ratings, and because I think the season is lesser than the sum of its parts because of how episodic it is, which I think a 7 is fitting for the season score as well. A 7 is good, not great, which I think is what the season was, which is disappointing. The series had limited animation, uninspired visuals, is distractingly bad at being a period piece, and gives us some very boring adaptations of certain characters. But the series does some very interesting twists on certain other characters, has some very powerful moments and really interesting storylines, and then comes to a pretty good conclusion, especially when it comes to the portrayal of Two-Face and his storyline. And then just in general, I did like this version of Batman. All in all though, because this is the first Batman TV show in a decade, has been in development for years, and does not live up to the quality of recent other comic book animated series like Invincible, X-Men 97, or even in my opinion, DC's other tentpole character, My Adventures with Superman. So all of that combined does unfortunately make this series a bit of a disappointing one for me. Even if it isn't bad, hopefully season 2 could be better, because a 7 out of 10 is not what I was hoping for.